Kyle Bass as well, both well known to the CNBC audience. And the Committee on Present Danger is the fourth iteration of really an organization that was built in the 1950s to counter Russian influence as well. It's gone through a number of cycles. This fourth cycle really is based on the China threat. These two gentlemen are members of that organization. Steve, to start with you, listen, okay, I heard your talk, and there's a lot of talk about the China threat. Per capita income of $9,000. Right, agrarian, pre-industrial economy still, demographic cliff. Why do you believe China really is such a threat to the United States and the global economy?
Well, look at what they're doing. Look at One Belt, One Road, made in China 2025, and the 5G rollout of Huawei. They have a converging geopolitical strategy to combine to basically unite the Eurasian landmass into one single market and to force the United States first out of the Western Pacific, then out of the Pacific overall, and off the Eurasian landmass. I mean, they are the most significant existential threat that we've ever faced. And on a per capita basis, it may be correct, but they're a major financial power, a major industrial power, and the radical cadre. This is not the Chinese people. The Chinese people are among the most hardworking and decent people in the world. This is about a radical cadre that is taking charge of the Chinese Communist Party, led by President Xi and Wang Qishan and other of his henchmen, that are driving us to really, they've been running economic war against the industrial democracies, Japan, South Korea, North America, and Western Europe for 20 years.
Isn't it, Steve, is it industrial war, or is it just exactly what the United States did 100 years ago? Right? We were the low-cost labor producer to England. We had child labor. We had all these labor law violations 7 days a week. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory.
Hang on.
How are they? They're just trying to build their economy the same way we built ours.
100% different. We still had the rule of law. Right? We had the Constitution. We had free speech. We had freedom of religion. We had freedom of expression. We had free market capitalism. Okay, what they have is exactly opposite, right? They are basically, and this is what you see with both the Uyghurs and what their technology and their facial recognition. They essentially run almost a slave camp, right? They are a suppressive, totalitarian dictatorship that the West has financed. It's totally different than the rise of the United States, which just was a rise of another developing country like India and others. You don't see what China is foisting on the world, and right now they've got this predatory capitalism like the British East India Company that is this One Belt, One Road that they get these countries in debt traps, foreclose on the assets, and then take total control. So this is a radically different thing than the rise of America. I'll get to it in a second.
I got to follow up one on that because you had a line in there which I think opened a lot of eyeballs because there's a lot of Wall Street people that were listening to you, and you said corporate America is the lobbying firm for the Chinese Communist Party, and Wall Street is the investor relations firm for it. Really? Corporate America is funding the Chinese Communist Party?
By the way, the entire operation of the Chinese Communist Party and what they're running in China is being funded by Wall Street, which Kyle can walk through, being funded by Wall Street. And corporate America, remember PBS or NPR had this thing the other day about intrusions into stealing intellectual property in American companies. They talked to a Treasury official that went around to like 200 companies. Not one company had been stolen from would press charges because they didn't want to be blocked out of China. Corporate America today is the lobbying arm of the Chinese Communist Party, and Wall Street is the investor relations department. You can see this on President Trump's trade negotiation, which I say is basically an armistice on the economic war. When Li He comes to the United States, where does he go first? He goes to meet. He had a lunch. This is about 2 months ago.
The Chinese trade representative reports to President Xi.
He comes the first day. He has a lunch with representatives, the government affairs guys, and the COOs and the presidents of the biggest companies in China to put pressure on President Trump. All the pressure coming from President Trump to get a deal is not from the Chinese. It's from Wall Street, and it's from industrial America.
Okay, Kyle, you've been critical of China and their economy and their banking system and their currencies for a long time. How to tie in what Steve is saying to what you're trying to do. Your first investor letter in 3 years came out today called The Quiet Panic, talking about Hong Kong. Do you believe the political issues there are bleeding into the markets, which, by the way, as I don't need to tell you, are the strongest performing stock markets in the world this year?
Yeah, well, you have incredible debt-led growth in China, but I do agree with what Steve's saying, specifically about corporate America being the lobbying arm of the Chinese. Look at who fought CFIUS reform. Some of the biggest Fortune 500 companies in the United States and Wall Street lobbied together to fight CFIUS reform. And CFIUS,
it's a Committee for Foreign Investment in the U.S. that decides whether something's a security violation. Just
right.
For people who don't know.
Basically, protecting national security from investment, let's say, from the Communist Party or by the Communist Party. So Steve is right 100% on who's fighting. If you look behind the scenes, it's corporate America pushing Trump to do a deal, and it's the corporate American chieftains that have their biggest businesses let's say, most growth coming out of China. And China plays that card. They play it better than anyone else. They open a market to very specific people to basically court influence with that person and going into the presidential office to actually change policy.
Remember, before President Trump came, we had kind of these disparate movements and kind of talking to China. Now we have a whole of government. If you look at Pence's speech at Hudson Institute, we have a whole of government approach to really confront China on this economic war. This has never happened. Whether it was a Democratic administration or Republican administration, the permanent political class and their paymasters on Wall Street were totally all about strategic economic dialogue. That has allowed China to tap us along while they do more forced technology transfers, intellectual property theft, and keep this massive subsidies the state-owned industry.
Steve, corporate America, public companies anyway, have a fiduciary duty to maximize their shareholder value. Can you blame corporate America from going into China and trying to get the best deal possible?
Corporate America has. I went to Harvard Business School and worked at Goldman Sachs.
And you lived in China, correct?
I've lived in China off and on. I've owned businesses over there. I worked at Goldman Sachs. I've worked on deals, cross-border deals, for 20, 30 years. What corporate America has a fiduciary responsibility for is their stakeholders. Maximization of shareholder value is one, but they also have it to their employees. They also have it to the country. They're just not domiciled here. These are American corporations. What Trump has done is, I think, get everybody focused on, and behind closed doors, a lot of these guys saying, yes, the forced technology transfers are terrible, but I can't get into China. I can't tap the market. I can't tap the low production costs unless I do business with them.
What do you tell GM? Don't sell a Buick into China? Don't sell a Cadillac?
No, what you do is you back President Trump. President Trump, that's why the 6 verticals, remember, he promised in the State of the Union, he would bring structural changes to the Chinese economy to integrate it more into the free market industrial democracies. Remember, we have 2 different systems running right now. They're a totalitarian mercantilist system. What he's trying to do in these structural changes, which forced technology transfers, non-trade barriers, currency manipulation, the cyber intrusions, all of those verticals. What Lighthizer and Navarro are trying to do is get major structural changes as a beginning to really bring China more into what I call the Westphalian Western democracies, the nation state, and not just so that they're the center of the manufacturing universe. People should look at. They don't call it one belt, one road anymore, right? Because they knew the terminology looked like they were trying to dominate the Eurasian landmass. They don't call it Made in China 2025 anymore. They haven't talked about that in 6 months because they understand the West was starting to wake up under Trump to say, hey, look, unless we confront this today, not just tap it along, unless we confront it today, in 5, 10, 15 years, they're going to be the dominant economic power in the world.
Your newsletter, though, Kyle, there's 2 systems as well economically. There's domestic and there's Hong Kong. Right. Hong Kong has got this sort of unique system. There's a story in the Journal the other day about how we can't sell satellites to China, but these Hong Kong-based companies can lease them because they're under sort of a different sphere. And I don't want to misquote you, your newsletter effectively says that the Hong Kong dollar needs to drop because Hong Kong is what? Just like you correctly predicted, subprime is a bubble?
Well, I think, look, something that was fixed 36 years ago for different economic and political reasons doesn't have the same economic and political reasons to be fixed today. And the thing I point out is Hong Kong happens to be the place where the Chinese raise all of their dollars, right? They do equity offerings, they do bond offerings.
With a lot of American money behind it, by the way.
When American pensions and endowments invest in China, they send the money to Hong Kong. Hong Kong has a very, very important free trade relationship with the U.S. that we signed as part of the U.S.-Hong Kong Policy Act in 1992. But we as a country required Hong Kong to live up to a few things for us to maintain that agreement every year. And they need to have an autonomy in their economy, they need to have an autonomy in their judicial system, and they must keep a free democracy. And for those people that think Hong Kong is going to be this oasis of democracy in Southeast Asia, they're just wrong.
4 pro-democracy activists were sent to 16 months in prison yesterday in Hong Kong. Today, by the way.
So my point,
Chinese nationals.
My point isn't as narrowly focused on where the currency's going, Brian. What I'm saying is, if you look at Hong Kong, their banks are now almost 900% of their GDP. Their household leverage is 300% of GDP. They're the most levered, developed country in the world. They're running out of their reserves. They spent 80% of their reserves defending this 36-year-old peg that I think is going to end up falling because their economy is more linked to China than it is to the U.S. 36 years ago, they were more linked to U.S. economic growth, and there was a synchronicity.
You got famous because a number of years ago, you and a few small groups of others were screaming about subprime. people said you were nuts, that you were wrong, that you were clearly off.
Partially correct.
Look, you had hair then. Okay, okay, it was going. And by the way, then a few years later, they made a book about you guys being right when everyone said you were wrong. Do you believe that's the case with Hong Kong right now?
Well, I mean, the numbers are impossible to argue. All right, the outcome is what's under debate. And look, if you look at it and develop an objective opinion here as to where the imbalances are, you have a 36-year peg that creates a pressure cooker, and it looks like the pressure cooker is about to go off. And about to, in the timeline of 36 years, might mean a year, it might mean 2 years, it might mean
what does that look, quickly,
might mean 6 months.
I want to get back to see what's the outcome that you're looking for then.
No, I mean, I think you're going to see a revaluation of all the Southeast Asian currencies, including Hong Kong. Down, including China and Hong Kong.
Joe Biden.
I think, first off, Joe Biden's going to Pennsylvania today to try to cut into. He understands that he's got to deliver the Midwest and the industrial blue-collar workers, the Reagan Democrats that came over and voted for President Trump. He's in Pittsburgh today. He's a total hypocrite. What he should do, first he should explain.
Why is he a hypocrite?
In 2013, he took his son on Air Force Two, I think it was, and the son, a week later, cut a $1 billion deal with the Bank of China on a private equity fund. Remember, we kicked off, I worked on Clinton Cash with Peter Schweitzer for years, which was the thing that got the Clintons rolling and put them under spotlight of the corruption. We also did one that I took off for the White House in the campaign, but Secret Empires specifically calls out the Bidens. And what Joe Biden's got to do, he's got to talk about his relationships with senior members of the Chinese Communist Party. He's got to talk about his relationships with financial institutions, he and his son, where this $1.5 billion fund came from. And Biden was part of the Obama administration. They looked the other way when those stationary islands were built in the South China Sea, which is the single biggest national security threat to the Western democracies, is closing off the South China Sea. That happened on Joe Biden's watch. He didn't say a word. What we need to hear from Joe Biden, he's up in Pennsylvania. He ought to say why he didn't put tariffs on steel and aluminum when he was vice president of the United States and didn't have President Obama did. It's Donald Trump that did that. All the happy talk, all Joe Biden is nothing but happy talk because protecting American workers.
Stuff you're talking about, I can't verify it. I wasn't there. I didn't write the book. I'm going to ask you a more basic question. Hold on. Can he win? You said the other day to Joe Kernan on CNBC the other day, maybe a month and a half ago, that it was Kamala, Beto.
I think somebody
was
like
the
Kamala,
combination that could beat Trump. Can Biden win?
Absolutely not. Joe Biden will not win their primary. You're seeing peak Biden right now. Joe Biden will not be able to stand up in this primary process, and no chance of that he can take on Donald Trump one-on-one. He doesn't have the stamina. He doesn't have the smarts. He doesn't have the actual get into combat with somebody like Trump. Trump, and I think the Democrats are going to understand that. I think you're seeing peak Biden right now. But what Biden's got to understand, he starts going around and blowing smoke up, talking to blue-collar workers.
He's from Scranton, for Pete's. Hold on, I've got to ask you.
Then why did he not defend these workers? Why did it take Donald Trump to do it?
We're out of time. I got to ask you this. Do you believe what's going to be the culmination of the Mueller report? Will Donald Trump, your former boss, be impeached?
Absolutely zero. They're not even. I mean, the Mueller, people should read the Mueller report. There's absolutely there's absolutely no collusion, as Donald Trump said. And I actually recommended don't fire Comey because there's no collusion.
It's in there.
There's no collusion. There's no obstruction. And so I think this thing passes. The Democrats are going to try to, like I said, this is going to be the 6 months of terrible vitriol because every day they're going to go. They're going after his finances. They're going to go after his family. They're going to go after everything because they control the House. Donald Trump will power through this, but the Democrats are going to need somebody that can mobilize. And I'm going to tell the Democrats something. Unless you start talking about China, you're not going to be competitive in 2020 against Donald Trump. They had 5 hours on CNN the other night. One thing you never hear about is China.